Now that you've finished making all the granny squares you need for that beautiful project, that waistcoat, tablecloth, blanket, funky pair of trousers, let me show you some of my favourite ways to join your granny squares together. Let's get started. These are some just plain traditional granny squares that I want to show you how to stitch together. In our other video, you'll learn how to make a granny square. There are so many different variations of granny square, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So the good thing about granny squares is that because you're working to a formula, the number of stitches from one side to the other is always the same. And the good thing about that is that it makes it very easy to sew together. Now for these granny squares, I have used Paintbox WoolMix Aran, which is a fantastic yarn for blankets because it's super hardy, it's soft, it's got wool in it and a bit of acrylic, which means that you can wash it in the machine if you need to, if somebody tips something on your beautiful blanket. But it's just wool, gives you a little bit of warmth. There are so many great yarns to use for granny blankets, and we will add some in the description so you can have a choose. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at two different ways of putting them together. So you can either use a tapestry needle to sew them together, or you can crochet them together. So first of all, I'm just going to show you how to sew them together. And if you're making a giant granny square, the first thing I would say is, if you've got a pattern, is to lay them all out on the floor so you know exactly which ones are going where. And then you sew them up into, say for example, strips. And when you've sewn this strip together and another strip, then you sew the strips together at the side. So let's put these together and have a look. So let's have a look at the edge of the granny square. You've got here the edges of a stitch, and you know that well-known granny stitch, crochet stitch, we've got a little V. And there are three ways that you can sew these little V's together. You can either use the back loop of the stitch, the front loop of the stitch, or both loops of the stitch, both legs. Actually, there's another way where we use the horizontal bar in the middle of the stitch. So let's start off. I'm using a contrast colour yarn here, and I'll show you the way that each of these things look. The first thing you could try is you put your granny squares front sides together. So this is the right side of a granny square, and this is the wrong side of the granny square, or the back. And they do look really different. If I hold them up so you can see, that's the right side, that's the back side, the wrong side. So make sure first of all that all your granny squares are sitting in the right way up. And to sew them together, I like to put the right sides together. And when you look then with right sides together, you can see you've got two sort of tram lines of stitches. Now the first thing we could do is we could try sewing together the inside stitches. I'm going to call these the inside and the outside stitches rather than front and back, because they're different for each square. But when you have the two together with the right sides facing, we'll talk about the inside leg of the stitch, and we'll talk about the outside leg of the stitch, like that. So let's start off doing a simple whip stitch with the inside leg. So I'm just putting my needle through there, and because I'm using this contrast yarn, you can see, then I'm going to come back the other side, just using those inside two legs of the stitches. And here we go, inside and inside, and the inside loop and the inside loop. In actual fact, what they are is the outside, is the front loop and the back loop of each of these stitches, but we'll call them inside and outside. And then I'm going to pick them up there, the inside loops. Now, once you've pulled those together, I'm just going to show you that is what the join looks like. Now, because I've used a contrast colour, you can see the stitches, but actually if you weren't using a contrast colour, that basically just gets the stitches sitting next to each other in quite a nice flat way. So that's the first way, sewing together the inside stitches. So now let's use the whole stitch. So we're going to use both legs of the stitch on both sides. So I'm going to put my needle through both legs of the stitch on both sides, like that, all four, and bring it through. I'm going to come back the other side, both legs, and again, both legs and both legs. So you can work your way zigzagging between these, and this time we're using it stitch for stitch, so you're matching both legs of the stitch and both legs of the stitch. And let's have a look at that. So that gives you a slightly different appearance. That gives you more of a sort of a little train track that's joined together. It's a little bit more of a design feature. I quite like that one. So that's another way that you can join them together. Now let's have a look at using the horizontal bar. So I'm going to put the right sides together, and this time if you sort of squidge up the stitch here, if I dig down into this stitch, I find a little horizontal bar. So I'm going to pull my yarn through there, and then I'm going to go across the road over here and little dig inside those two V's, and you'll find a horizontal bar. Oopsie. Go back. And then I'm going to come to my next stitch here, and just when you put your needle in, you'll find that little horizontal. Now this is probably the one that I like best because it sort of conceals the join the most. I'm going to little dig into the opposite stitch and find that horizontal bar. The only thing about this is that it does take a little bit longer. And then dig in and find the little bar inside the stitch there. But it does make for a more invisible join. There it is. But it does take you a little bit longer. There it is. And when you've worked all the way along, often what happens is that by the time you get to the point where you're going to sew everything in, you're so desperate to get it sewn together, you'll go with the sort of quickest route you can find. But let's have a look at that. Now, that one, I remember that the yarn, the purple would disappear and it's just green. If you use the same colour yarn, you can't really see that join once you pull it tight. It's the most invisible, the horizontal bar, and it sits the squares completely flush together. So that is using the little horizontal bar in the middle of the stitch. Very, very nice, but a bit more fiddly. Let's look at the next method. The next method is using your crochet hook. So I'm putting the right sides together. You can either do it with the wrong sides together or the right sides together. It really doesn't matter. Let's go with the wrong sides together this time. But just make sure that you stick with one or the other. Either keep the right sides together or the wrong sides together. If you have the right sides together, you're going to get more of a feature on the front of the blanket for the join. So this time I'm going to use my crochet hook. So I'm going to put we're going to work the same way. So your stitches match up, and remember that we have the inside two stitches and the inside legs of the stitch and the outside legs of the stitch. So I'm going to work on the inside legs. I'm just going to pull them in with my crochet hook, and you're almost going to slip stitch these together. So I'm going to put my hook into the inside and the inside leg, grab the yarn and pull through into a slip stitch. So then I put through the inside leg and the inside leg, and then pull it through into a slip stitch. Now when you use this inside legs together and the slip stitch, you get a really pretty kind of train track down the middle, which you'll see in a minute, the slip stitch pattern. Like that. Remembering that that would be green if you were doing it to match. I'm just doing it in the contrast colour to show you. You get a lovely flat seam that gives you this lovely kind of train track finish. So that I also really love. That can be really good. So that is using a slip stitch on the right side, just with the inside loops of the stitches together. Let's have a look at something else. So this time let's put the fronts together, and this time we could crochet through all 4 legs of the stitches like you did. In fact, let's do it with the right sides together so you can see the look of that, the wrong sides together. If you're going to put both legs of the stitches together, there, and so we've got the wrong sides together here, and I'm going to use a US single crochet, UK double crochet to put these together. So I'm going to pull through all 4 legs of the stitch, pull my yarn through, and then I'm going to go into the next 4 legs like that, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. So I'm going to go into the next 2 legs, next 2 legs. That's all 2 stitches. Pull up the loop, yarn over and pull through. And then we do that again through all 4 legs, both sides, pull up a loop, yarn around and pull through. I'll just do another one through all 4, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. Just do one for luck. Through all 4 legs, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. See, I'm just going to pull that loop up to show you, and this gives you a very nice, prouder sort of train track look. So you've got the stitches that actually looks a little bit like a seam. So that adds a sort of bit of texture to your stitches. So if you want something more of a really obvious join all the way through, you could also do that, just single crochet US, double crochet UK them together. And that looks lovely. There are so many different ways, and you can experiment. When you get to the corners, whether you're sewing them together or you are crocheting them together, just make sure that you get the corner stitches matching exactly. And if you hold the 2 squares together, your corners will match exactly the right number of stitches, because the granny square has the same stitch count all the way along. So those are a few different ways to join up your granny squares. I would just say that if you are making your granny squares, if you're planning them out and you're not just working from scraps, have a think about the way that you want to join them and the colour that you want to join them with before you start. Because you might decide, like me with this square here, that you're going to make all the last rounds of your granny squares all the same colour. And then it would make sense to either choose the same colour to sew them all up with, or to choose a contrast one if you want to be a little bit more funky. But it's worth remembering, once you start, think to yourself, okay, what am I going to sew them up with? And if you want to do it seamlessly, make sure that all your last rounds are the same colour and that you have the same colour to sew them up in. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. I do love a granny square. I'd love to see all your granny squares joined up. Don't forget to leave me a comment and tell me what you're going to make with all your granny squares and how you prefer to join them. There are lots of tips and tricks and techniques to learn. Don't forget to like and subscribe for all the updates to the channel. Happy crochet!